before we get to the VTC, let's just stick to that issue also around market access that you also raised. And I also want Jason to jump in there and probably also Roland there as well. You mentioned the issue around agriculture, which is a good example. I said, look, we can produce some fresh stuff. We know that a lot of the communal farmers, of course, also produce at a very small scale. But there's always been this view that markets in the country are very formalized and highly regulated. Very good example is, for example, the retail sector. Many would say, even if I produce a music CD, for example, because we're saying and say, look, we need people to become more entrepreneurial. We need people to rather become job creators than job seekers. But if I have a music CD that I've developed, or at our farm, we've set up a small hydroponic solution that provides certain amounts of kilograms of green peppers, for example, it's very difficult for those farmers to get their items stocked in the shops, because we know that the retail market is very formalized. Is it an issue of a bit of deregulation there, or are we also talking more around consumer behavior? Because Namibians love things. We'd rather go buy in a mall setting than go buy in a boutique that gets started on Independence Avenue. Can you chat to us a little bit about that? I think Jason or Roland, you can touch on that.
I'm happy to go, but Jason, you.
Wow, sure, it's a mouthful. Yeah, market entrance and the barrier to entering the market, especially for your smaller businesses and so on, especially your local market, there's always the argument about scale and our population, etc., not being big enough, which I feel sometimes is just an excuse, because I think that it's important that we've got sort of regulatory or policy environments that allow us to build local champions. And out of those local champions, you can then get them to become export ready and export competitive. But however, again, it's a matter of how do you scale those small businesses for this small market to be able to accommodate them at a profit or at a return. But in other environments, and I think I've had this conversation with Roland before around our regulatory environment and the barriers that certain sectors have in terms of entrance into that market, especially from a regulatory point of view, you find that there's a one blanket or one size fits all, especially with regulators. So compliance issues for a bigger, larger enterprise remain the same compliance issues that a smaller player in the market would need to also comply to, which in all intents and purposes, from a practical standpoint, is just not possible. The one employs 50 people, the other guy employs 3 people and would like to get into a certain regulated sector, be it energy or be it finance, etc. So we need to have a serious diagnosis in terms of how does our environment actually create a fertile ground for our young entrepreneurs and our smaller SMEs to actually enter that environment. And I always say that that is sort of the cheapest form of creating a change and creating GDP growth, is actually by doing some of those simple but tough decisions of review and deregulation in some areas.
Yeah, so I think Jason and I agree dangerously often. But yeah, I mean, this question of like how you get growth to filter into households is very linked to SMEs. I mean, I made this comment the other day and I got quite a lot of grief for it, but like ONL employs 6,000 odd people. That's roughly 1% of the people who are employed in the formal sector in Namibia, right? Who employs the rest? And we started going through like how many do the banks employ? How many do the other big private or big public companies employ? How many do the private companies, the large private companies employ? You don't get very far. And basically you end up with there's like a lot of people who have jobs, and to try and figure out exactly where they're employed is difficult because it's relatively small scale employers. And when we start looking at, okay, well, you know, what do these small scale employers have in common? Well, what they have in common is like a really, really difficult time surviving. And we believe that, you know, you sit with this basic challenge as a company, right? So a company is there to make profit. If a company doesn't make profit, it burns through its reserves and then it closes its doors, sends its employees home, right? So a company is there to make profit. And if you just consider what profit is, it's the residual of your income once you've taken off your expenses. So you can try and make, you know, small companies successful and small companies survive through boosting that revenue line at the top, which is quite a complicated thing to do for a small business. especially from like a central planning kind of perspective. You can leave it to the entrepreneur to do, and the entrepreneur is likely to be, fairly well suited in doing that. But where you really can, and they're the best suited person to do that, but where you really can help small businesses particularly is on that cost line. And sure, I mean, there's some costs that businesses are always going to incur. But there's a lot of kind of hidden costs to doing business which have a disproportionately large impact on smaller entities and smaller enterprises. And my suspicion is that this is really one of the things that concretizes the high levels of youth unemployment that we have, the fact that we don't see the kind of transformation that we want to see in our corporate space, that there are very, very few like real post-independent success stories of small businesses that started as small businesses, because every business starts as a small business, right? Very few businesses go from nothing to a big business. They start as a small business, and if you want them to become a big business, you need to support and incubate them. And that can be done very directly or indirectly, but if you don't allow these businesses to grow, you're never going to get, these big sort of post-independent success stories. And if you look at those sort of challenges, those barriers to entry, they're innumerable, right? There's the regulatory burden. I think what Jason mentioned, completely agree. I mean, if you're a big asset manager or a small asset manager, chances are that your compliance costs are going to be pretty similar. But with the size of a big asset manager, you can employ 5 people just to do compliance. Small asset manager, you don't really have the same opportunities or the same possibility. And the same applies, for many, many different sectors and for many different industries. And there are definitely those types of hidden costs. But then what we also seem to have, and I think it's largely due to the scale of our economy, is that we have, in most sectors, quite big and quite established players. And those big and established players are players that became established often decades ago or outside of the country. So you've got these like pre-independence players. Let's take the beer market as an example. One big player, like colonial era player, has become established. And now for a new entrant, like Desert Lager as an example, to try and break in there is extremely challenging. And so you've got basically these monopolies probably born out of just the size of the economy, that there's not, historically at least, been that much room for 2 major players, or 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever major players. But, because we have these big established players that are either old or externally, grown, it's very difficult for our small players to compete. And I think when it comes to the likes of our competition commission, I don't really see the competition commission playing as actively as it could to make the playing field more level for new entrants to combat that sort of monopolistic behavior that we do see.
And I think I just wanted to zoom in on that a little bit, just spend like 5 more minutes on that issue, because it's an important one. We know that the retail charter, for example, with the Namibian Trade Forum, said, look, we want a mandatory 25% local products on the shelf. And then, of course, there was alarm. There were concerns around protectionism, et cetera, It is those connotations, et cetera. And it became voluntary. But we haven't seen any shift in as far as that market is concerned, even though now this charter has been implemented because it's voluntary. Is it a matter of, because on one side we're saying, look, we need to deregulate, but on the other side we're saying we need to use public policy to push and create some sort of access, especially where the markets are mature, like you were mentioning, Roland, for small and medium enterprises. I mean, how do we balance? Are there perhaps certain sectors that we need to zoom in on and take on? Or do we say that let the market take care of itself as per Alan Smith's dream? Roland?
So I think if you want to grow SMEs at this stage, I think market taking care of itself will probably not get you there. Of course, you do not want to overregulate, because overregulation and no regulations are the same. So you kind of have to balance that. But I just want to ask a question. I'm now Nangula, and I sit somewhere in a village, and I now start producing. I want my produce to get to the shelf. Please tell me, where do I go?
Amta?
Okay, fine, for agriculture. And if I'm making uniform? So I think that rests my point. That's actually, so that is just what I have to say. So Roland can go on, but I think that is just where we need to start. And I know there is a investment center and where have you, but I think at this stage, yes, it might be working for some people that know whatever, but I don't think this is something we are driving and encouraging people and saying, where do you register? How can we help you? What you need? What is required first? Because what is in demand and what is the access? How can we support you? We almost need to go and search. Do you want to to start a business? Please come, because we do not have many entrepreneurs in Namibia. So we need entrepreneurs, and we need to kind of almost beg them and give them ideas and say, here it is, we will open the market for you. You just think about something to produce. But at this stage, that's not what we're doing. And therefore, what happens? Everybody's looking for a job. Nobody's creating one, because they can create one and they miss the market.
We could possibly also have an answer. I'll let you continue just now, Roland. Maybe we might have an answer from the floor, but I'll open up the floor right now for any contributions, whether it's a question or a comment. If I let Eben start right now, I'm not sure we want Eben to be the first contribution. Do we have any? Okay, Eben, please. Can we bring the microphone just to the front here? No, but we need it for the podcast. Yeah, for the podcast. Please, just to the front.
I hate to start. Sorry about that. You had no other option? So, I'll start with a question and just give a few points after that. What is our real problem? And what can we do to change that? And I want us to think about where we must put our energy in and not look for so many alternative answers. So 2016, we sat in a big hall with also overloaded like this one, and we had a discussion on NIF, and we were told by the people that came from the office of the Prime Minister that it is a done deal, it's going to happen, and we said there that we will in 2 years have halls filled to the brim with the headings of the topic of the discussions. How are we going to save our economy? I was 1 year out. Now we're here. So the economists will know that the University of Stellenbosch did studies and found that economic growth is not what is needed to uplift people. We need to uplift people to get economic growth. We need human development. And human development, basically 3 pillars: education, good healthcare system, and personal security, housing. We read in the paper that City of Windhoek hasn't built or hasn't developed a serviced land, One Earth, for a year. And during that year, their salary bill is $1.3 billion. We know what the educational investment is. We know what the educational outcomes are. So are these not the structural problems that we need to address to really get our economy going, instead of the populist policies that we put in place that only make things worse? Thanks.
Do we have another contribution?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Thank you very much, Eben, for setting the tone. Very brief contribution there. We had a hand up there. Yes, sir. And then we'll shoot to that side as well. We'll give you next.
Okay, my name is Michael, and just that. Yeah. Roland, you spoke about the nexus between cost of employment and also the productivity. Could you perhaps just put that into perspective in terms of how the public service captures that? Public service is a huge employer, but in terms of productivity, is that captured?
Well, we knew that one was going to come up. Yes, we've got one more contribution there before we bring it back to the panel.
Yeah, can I ask a question? I'm from Yunnan. If you go to Yunnan today and you go across the road, there are 20 Namibians making a living selling food at really relatively low prices to students. But why are they selling that food across the road and not at Yunnan? Because Yunnan won't let them, all right? And that's the jackboot of the state on the throat of Namibian people everywhere. I've lived in many developing countries where the government helps the development of small markets. Here we do everything to stop the poor from going into business. All right?
Roland, next is between cost and productivity.
I want to actually jump back a little bit. So we have a weird situation here, right? we look at how can we support small businesses, and how do we do that by giving them things to make their life easier. And it feels to me very much like, so I use tax as an example of this a lot. We want to set up a fund to help small businesses. So basically what we do is we tax all businesses, including small businesses. We run the money that we collect through the bureaucratic system, and we give a bit of it back to small businesses. Right? That doesn't seem like an incredibly efficient solution. And that's just on the direct tax, right? For every dollar that we pay in direct tax, there's probably 20, 30, 40 cents in indirect tax or hidden tax or just costs of doing business as well. So surely the first solution is that we try and reduce those costs for these small businesses to try and make them, have greater success. So firstly, some of these hidden costs. You're a small entity. Why, you're not gonna damage the market in some way if you behave poorly in most sectors. If you're relatively small, you don't make a meaningful contribution to tax, etc. Why are we regulating so heavily? The food sellers opposite UNAM being a good example as well. Why do we regulate these smaller entities? Why do we expect them to register for tax and VAT and similar when really those contributions that we get from them are relatively meaningless? If they grow, if they become big employers, if they become big entities, then we can start to get, the Caesar's pound of flesh, as it were. But why do we put that same burden on these small entities? That simply doesn't make sense. And especially just to take some of that money and give it back to those small entities. Surely if it's more efficient to leave it in the entities. I take that argument further and I say if you're a small entity, and I make a specific proviso here that you must be smaller than my business. Because if it's my business or bigger, then I'm just trying to punt for my own interest apparently. So smaller than my business. Why charge company tax at all? Company taxes, as far as the shareholder is concerned, a tax on capital. We have a capital deficient economy. We know this because we're desperately trying to put up venture capital funds and bring pension fund money back into the country and attract foreign investment. So we've got a capital deficient economy. Why are we taxing capital of small investors? What's the purpose of that? Do we really think that for a small investor, for a small business person, the money that you take away from them can be more efficiently utilized in the economy through the bureaucratic system of government than those entrepreneurs can use it themselves? I personally don't believe so. I'd like to see zero tax on profit for small companies. Sure, if you're taking money out of the company and it becomes an income stream, then tax it as an income stream. So tax a dividend, tax salaries, tax those sorts of things. But if it's capital in the business being invested to develop and grow that business, why are we taxing it? That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, to come to the specific questions, I agree with Ibn to an extent, right? I agree that NEF is a problem, and I agree that many of the policies that we're pursuing are a problem. But I don't think that these are the exclusive issues. I think that if we don't get those issues right, they will become material, or they have already probably become material issues in the economy. But I don't think that just getting rid of NEF. So say the president goes on TV tomorrow and rips up NEF. Say the president goes on TV tomorrow and rips up the new exchange control bill. Say the president goes on TV and rips up NEPA. I don't believe that results in growth and high quality growth in and of itself. I think if he doesn't do those things, there's a chance that we don't see growth irrespective of what else happens. But I don't think that doing that in and of itself is sufficient. I do think that some of the other kind of deregulation at a much more granular level, and particularly on these small businesses, which are the big employers, which are in many ways a kind of silver bullet to high quality growth and growth revival. I think that kind of deregulation is just as important, if not more important. When it comes to, I completely agree. Education, health, and housing, critical issues. If we don't get those issues right, I think that we will continue to have high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, and probably relatively low levels of growth. The questions around education and health for me are very interesting, particularly because I think that we spend disproportionately more than many other countries in the world on those. I mean, our education spend is roughly twice the global average. If you look at basic numeracy and literacy rates of kids leaving primary school, the UNICEF statistics, it's about half the global average. So we're spending twice as much and we're getting roughly half the outcome, so a quarter the efficiency. And I think that there's a lot of issues around that, similar on healthcare. And in my view, a lot of this is because the end user of public education, public health, has no choice. So the end user, if you are from region X or village X, your kids go to school in that village unless you've got, some reason to, a relative with an address somewhere else or so on. If you don't like the quality of the education there, if the principal of that school keeps getting the kids pregnant, your recourse is not to deal with the principal. Your recourse is to deal with a public official in the office, most likely in Windhoek, thousands of kilometers away, who's never met you, never met your kid, etc. Your recourse is to move. That's a terrible solution. And we need to be giving the people who care about their health, care about their children's education, we need to be giving them a lot more choice. And that can be done through the process that we have now of collecting money, but the manner in which we spend it, I don't think, is working. And I think that that's something that we seriously need to relook at. Michael, I think you should have told people where you work. But the cost of productivity, the cost versus productivity in public services. So we haven't actually quantified public services specifically. But if you do a calculation of what we spend relative to GDP on the civil service, and if you look at the services that the civil service provides, so we basically correct for things like the National Health Service and in the UK and similar, we should have a civil service of roughly 35 to 45,000 people. Our civil service is 110 or 105 odd thousand people. So you can certainly, ask questions about the productivity. What we have quantified though is unit labor productivity in manufacturing. And there we're about 30% less efficient than South Africa. And South Africa is substantially less efficient than many of the developing Asian economies. And because we have a sort of globalized world, we're not competing with South Africa. We are competing with, many of the Asian countries. I think that I can only agree with the point on UNAM. I think, there's no reason not to try and foster and encourage that type of activity as opposed to discourage it.
The issue around housing, I think that Eben also mentioned, of course, is one thing that we were going to highlight here. We know that infrastructure development has been one of the buzzwords, especially from the side of government, is that we need to invest in infrastructure development, we need to invest there. And we know that with the gravy train coming to an end in 2016, that was, of course, also one of the areas that really, really affected. Jason, from your side, what sort of infrastructure should we focus on as a country? And how do we make this possible? Which infrastructure do we prioritize, really?
I think just briefly, the infrastructure that we should focus on should be infrastructure that leverages off of our advantage. Now, what are our advantages? Our geographical location. The continent has got 15 landlocked countries, and that has created quite a bit of barrier and challenges in terms of intra-Africa trade. So Namibia being located as we strategically located, we need to look at infrastructure that is a multimodal infrastructure. So I'm talking about air, rail, port, roads. So what this does for us as a country is that on the one end, it opens up market access for Namibia, and on the other end, it also allows other countries to be able to benefit, and we could benefit, or other countries to be able to operate within our market. I take the Zimbabwe dry port that was recently opened as an example of that. Now, how we look at financing this, we really have opportunities with our biggest trade partners, for example, to look at ways in which we can finance our multimodal infrastructure. But that is, for me, a key area of focus that we should probably look at when we're talking about infrastructure. Another one will be our telecoms. We can't run away from the fact that we've got no choice. The world is moving ahead, and we need to look at increasing our investment and our capacity in terms of becoming a data highway and being able to invest seriously in telecommunications. How we do it, I think the shortest and most simplest way is to create a regulatory environment that is investor-friendly and looks at anti-monopoly, obviously, practices, but that will be able to spur telecommunications investment. Hong Kong itself, some of the biggest contributors to GDP has been telecoms and fiber. So in terms of infrastructure within that space, that is probably what we should be looking at. Housing, again, is a separate thing that I wanted to also perhaps touch on. I think that was a serious and a real concern in terms of land delivery and the land delivery process that exists with local authorities in the country. It's not sustainable. On the other end, the cost of bulk infrastructure. city of Windhoek alone, most of our bulk infrastructure was built pre-independence, and we've got Brakwater that is overcapacitated by 120%. We've got lack of investment, but it's also similar in other African countries. We've got lack of municipal investment in bulk infrastructure, primarily also perhaps because government drive or priority in terms of that area does not receive the focus that it should. But it is a serious concern that the cost for bulk infrastructure, for example, for our own local authorities is shifted to the private sector. What that then does is that it makes housing at the end of the day unaffordable, because that price needs to be paid by someone, and that cost ends up going over to the end user. So I think we need to think of more creative, more straightforward ways in terms of making it possible for land delivery to be faster, but the cost-effective supply of land, bulk infrastructure and service land also to be prioritized and more feasible.
Well, I almost asked the question on suspension of CEOs, but I think that's for another platform. I'm going to throw it back to the floor.
To suspension of CEOs. and I wanted to come back to the point on productivity and, for example, the public wage bill. So the first thing somebody says that do what you love and you don't have to work for a day. So we are struggling with productivity because people are not doing what they love. They're doing what is available. So many times they don't choose what they're doing because they want it. It's because they want to make a living. And therefore, they're not motivated. They're not looking forward to going to work every day because they just want the salary. You cannot work for a salary and be motivated and be happy. You need to find something else that drives.